Hello, good afternoon, or good morning, depending where you are, and welcome back to World War II TV and the first episode in Jungles Week. So I hope you enjoyed Eastern Front Week, but we're kind of going to the other side of the world now for Jungles Week, and we've got a nice variety of shows coming up with you. American guests, British guests, Australian guests. It should be quite informative, so that'll be good. But today, starting the week off with an old mate of mine. In fact, 7 years ago today, he was touring with me in Normandy and a couple of other buddies. So he's toured with me several times in Normandy. This is his third appearance on World War II TV after the Machine Gun Show, which was one of our earliest ones. And then he talked about Alligator Ridge, I think Alligator Creek on Guadalcanal. But today we are talking about the John Basilone Medal of Honor action, which most of you will be familiar with from, if nothing else, episode 2 of the Pacific. But of course, it's one of those actions that is written about, talked about in numerous books about the Pacific. It gets lots of internet sites. So, but the thing is, Brian has been to Guadalcanal. He's been to the site. He's walked through the jungles there. And so therefore, he's the right person to talk about it. So good afternoon, Brian. How are you doing?
Good, Paul. How about yourself?
Well, I've got a bit of a sniffle, but nothing to worry about. It's better than another thing.
Is this on Saturday Night Live when you host the show, when you're on the show 5 times, you get to be in an exclusive club? I didn't know if you're going to have something.
Yeah, you get some kind of medal,
like a jacket,
but it's made of chocolate. Yeah.
Okay.
No, it's good. Yeah, no, there is a. You must be getting up there. Ben Main, I know, has done quite a few. Obviously, Mag's done a few, but yeah, no, it's good to come back and do more. It means that we're not awful if people want to come back and discuss it again. So, but as we talked about last time, Alligator Creek, the thing is, there's lots of people who are interested in the Pacific, but they just, myself included, never get an opportunity to go to these battlefields. The ETO is, even for people in the USA, is in some ways easier to get to because it's all in one kind of, you can drive between sites. When you're talking about islands, you could get to one, but getting to another one. But you've done quite a lot of them now with your work and stuff. And so how much, I mean, it's a silly question. We all know the answer, but how much do you get out of actually visiting the sites for yourself? That's the thing, isn't it? You can read about it all the time, standing there. That's what makes a difference, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, even going to Normandy, over the years and going to the ETO, you read about these things, and specifically like Normandy, when you're reading these accounts of these battles, and the first time that I was there, it was getting to be 9 o'clock. I think it was late May, and then it got to be 10 o'clock, and all of a sudden it's daylight still. There's still light out, and all of a sudden that light bulb clicks on. That you're going, oh crap, this is how they're able to fight. So it's getting to those locations, and then you go to the PTO, which it just brings everything into perspective when you're reading about the conditions and the heat and the bugs and all the creepy crawlies that are around, and it just gives you that extra level of appreciation. And again, it's very, very difficult to get through. I can hop on a flight from Pittsburgh nonstop to Paris, get a car up to Normandy within a few hours. To get to some of these locations in the Pacific, it involves probably 6 to 7 airplanes, a boat, some guy literally paddling in a hand-carved canoe to get to some of these locations. So it's a lot more difficult for sure.
Yeah, and you said it there yourself. The times you've been with me in Normandy, there are things that are contend with, like queues in the bakeries, possibly, nowhere to park at St. Mary Glees, but we don't have to worry about creepy crawlies. We don't have to worry about, 95% humidity and those sorts of things, and things biting you and falling from you and from the jungle canopy. And so that's the thing. So Jungles Week it's all about the terrain, isn't it? When we've had shows about the Chindits in Burma, it's half of the story there is just the physical conditions these guys are having to deal with. And as we know with the Pacific and Guadalcanal, the naval battle caused the Marines there to not have the supplies coming in. They weren't getting fresh water, they weren't getting food, they weren't getting changes of uniform, all those things that just, they don't help you win a battle, but they help your mental state deal with forthcoming battles. And the misery of this campaign was just that physical environment they're in there. And then you add a fanatical enemy who at this point in the war are deploying these desperate but terrifying all-in charges towards you. I mean, it's everything and the movies kind of get across in these kind of incidents. But anyway, let's get on. So folks, We've got, as usual, we've got a PowerPoint. Brian sent the phone. We've got a bit of video as well. Brian took there, but let's remind people where we're talking about. This is the Solomon Islands. It's 1942. This is the very first step, really, of the island hopping campaign to push the Japanese back towards the homeland. And it's fair to say it's come up on lots on World War II TV. 1942 is the year where everything could go either way. There's no, it's all a bit up in the air in every theater. And Guadalcanal is very much and could go either way campaign for much of its length there, and you know, fascinating stuff. But we'll just zoom in on the map there. So just how did you get there? When the time as you've been to Guadalcanal, how the hell did you get there?
So typically what happens is fly out of Los Angeles. Los Angeles, we'll either go to Fiji, the Fiji Islands, right down there towards the bottom, or Brisbane, Australia. So it's either been to those places, and then from there they have the flights into Honiara, which is now the capital of the Solomon Islands in Guadalcanal province.
Yeah, it's a bit of an ordeal, but we're talking, you know, and for those who haven't already, and I put the link below, you can watch Brian's previous show that kind of sets up the scene for this, because we talked a little bit about the landings there, and as we know that the first day for a lot of the units was nothing like as bad as the following days were going to be, and you know, we'll assume the viewers have a bit of an understanding about the Guadalcanal campaign in terms of the early stages. But when you get to as I said there in my intro at the top of the show, you get that point there where the U.S. Navy is not quite in support as it's supposed to be. Supplies are becoming an issue. The Japanese Navy is encroaching around it, and supplies and logistics was always going to be a problem with an island hopping campaign. But if you're not getting supplies, and just, I mean, the amount of drinking water the human body requires per day is beyond what was coming in, and that is always going to present an issue. But and this is when we say jungle, I mean, as we talked on the last show, it's not all palm trees, and some of it is kind of almost sort of open forest, isn't it? There's quite a lot of different terrain there. So give the viewers a kind of a bit of an idea of how the terrain varies over the island.
So Guadalcanal is very, very unique. It really has a sense of beauty to it, where you see a lot of it in books that were written, first account books. Richard Tregaskis, who wrote Guadalcanal Diary, a lot of those early works talked about the pure beauty of the island, and it does. Where it becomes very problematic is where you actually have to traverse your way through it. And Guadalcanal actually has these rolling grassy hills, and then in between those hills is this dense jungle. So if you can make it out of the jungle onto these grassy knolls, you either have somewhat normalized grass or really thick kunai grass, which was just razor sharp grass that, you know, I'm 6'3" and it, you know, comes up to here on me. So I can imagine some of those guys back then, you know, it was over their heads. And typically we estimated when we walked through there, it's about 10 degrees hotter in that grass. And it's cutting you up. It's cutting, you know, your uniform. Typically when we go there, we nerd out. We're wearing our marine utilities and trying to really get that feel. And it's cutting your utilities. It's cutting your hands. You're hot. You're miserable. It truly is. It is misery. Just all in this backdrop of a beautiful island location.
And that paradox of a beautiful place that's horrible. I mean, Robert Leckie writes about that in his letters, isn't it? In his book, and talks about how beautiful it is, but at the same time, everything there is trying to kill you, not least of which the enemy, but also all the bugs and the creepy crawlies and the diseases, right, and things, and right, and just dehydration can kill you, can't it? If you get it bad enough. So there's all sorts of ways for you to be hurt as a human being in this environment. And but we'll move on to we're talking October. We're talking essentially 79 years ago this month is when, but towards the latter part of October, these events are kind of rolling into. And so give us a sort of a rundown of what had been happening sort of between the landings and the time that we get to the John Basilone story, because it's been 2 months, isn't it, effectively?
Correct. Yeah. So the battle can really be broken down into a few segments. There's the August offensive, September offensive, the October offensive, the semi-November offensive that really doesn't materialize, and then December, January, February is when the Army comes in to really clean up the island. The overall, this is the longest campaign in any theater. The campaign to secure this island takes roughly about 6 months, from August to February of 1943. August, again, from the previous show of Alligator Creek, that's where the Japanese first come in to try to dislodge what they think is a raiding party. They don't realize it's an entire Marine division. Once they figure out that, yeah, we're going up against an entire division, in September, they go at it again, and that covers the Battle of Bloody Ridge, the Edson's Ridge, where the Marine Raiders and the parachute battalions hold off the Japanese onslaught, and that is probably and arguably the closest that the Japanese will get to that airfield. And again, that's the key right there. The whole purpose of this battle, the island itself of Guadalcanal is 90 miles long, 20 miles wide, but the entirety of the battle, for the most part of it, takes place in and around this airfield. It is the purpose of the Marines is to take that airfield and hold it, and that's so it's trying to get that sector and that loop around that airfield. They're not really able to do that until a few days after the Battle of Bloody Ridge on September 18th, when the 7th Marine Regiment, roughly about 4,000 men, are able to land on the island. And it's at this point that they're able to get that full encirclement around the airfield. If in our previous discussion or episode, there were just so many gaps and holes, and it was a gamble of where is the Japanese going to attack. And at this point now, we're able to really put that entire circle around the airfield. Not to the point that it's foolproof, but that really sets up October. And it's around this time that the Japanese and the Americans, they're all in. They both identified that this is the battle. This is the battle that is either going to win or lose the war for either of them. It is very, very important. There are discussions that are happening in Washington, D.C. at that time where they are discussing losing the 1st Marine Division. Is this going to be another battalion? What do we do if we end up losing this? Do they fight as guerrillas? Do we go to the table with the Japanese? These discussions are happening, and the Japanese are realizing that if we lose this island for as much as we committed, it's going to be a defensive fallback from there on out. So the importance of the October offensive really is everybody is going. We're all in.
Well, I think that's one of the most intriguing aspects is that there was, even as you said, there consideration that they may have to fight in the hills as guerrilla fighters, because this is not the American Army and Marines we think of the 44 era in the Pacific, where there's a quantity of logistics behind and the number of vessels behind support, the number of artillery, the number of guns that we can bring to bear when we invade an island later on. This is 42, when it's a cliche, but in many cases, the Marines on the line there, it's kind of like the circled wagons in a Western. There isn't much strength in depth behind. There aren't massed artillery pieces a couple of miles away they can call up. We haven't even got our air power in the area yet, because Allies are still building their air power. Right. So it is really a very old-fashioned ground struggle between two forces who want that same bit of ground. It sort of goes back to the sort of the Gettysburg or Waterloo or those sorts of battles where it is men against men in that kind of few hundred yards away from each other environment that we don't think of later in the war, where World War II becomes this all fronts, all spaces war of air power and navy power and everything else going on. This is old-fashioned fighting in many ways, isn't it?
They're just figuring it out. I mean, really, this is the first time in the history of the United States military that you're going to have combined efforts between air power, between the Army, the Navy, and the Marine Corps. That has never been done before. So you actually start to see the foundations of a joint air strike force that is happening. Being able to communicate again between different units, communicating with air power, communicating with the Navy. This is the first naval operation since 1898 that the United States is conducting. So they're figuring a lot of this out. And just like you said, you got to look through this in the lens of 1942, not Okinawa, Iwo Jima in 1945, where we're just coming at it with, the hammer of God, that all right, we just got to beat these guys. This is everything's in the balance, almost on a daily basis.
I mean, and even just, we'll come to the machine guns and things later on, but even just the individual gear used by the Marines, this is they're a lot. It's a cliche, but it's outdated equipment. They haven't adjusted yet. They've got the fighting spirit, they've got the reputation, but this is not the era where everything has been perfectly designed in theater for Pacific operations that you get by 44 and 45. This is what they're going out there with, what they had. So there are still 5-shot Springfields and water cooled machine guns rather than air cooled, and so on and so forth. And the gear.
They do have. So this is actually kind of a common misconception. The water cooled and the air cooled machine guns really are prevalent from Guadalcanal all the way through the entirety of the war, and they do actually have the light machine guns. They're using those as well. I think it's, for some reason, I think there's this. Everybody thinks that the water cools are mainly on Guadalcanal, and then you kind of don't see them throughout the rest of the war. When in actuality, they're used all the way up through, Okinawa with the Marine Corps, and at least in the Pacific, because they're such great heavy machine guns. I got one, but you can see it behind me here. I always got to keep
show and tell there.
Got to keep one handy, just in case. But because they're such a great defensive weapon for onslaughts of bonsai charges, and there's actually a really famous photo in Iwo Jima where there's a guy just firing one, and there's just piles of brass around him, the sustained fire that they're able to maintain.
Yeah, and again, if folks want to go in a deeper dive into the use of machine gun, Brian and Nick Budd and Richard Fisher on a show, whatever it was, a year ago about machine guns, and we talked about this at great length. And you said it there yourself, Brian, that a lot of what we're going to be talking about with the Basilone action, it's defensive, isn't it? Again, this is not the U.S. Marines of 44 and 45. Of course, there were defensive elements of those battles that to come, but they were more about attempting to quickly seize areas and moving on. This, as you say, longest campaign of World War II, and a lot of it is largely defensive. It's holding a line with fewer men than you'd like in terrain that is not really suited, because you haven't got the distance, you haven't got the open plains, you haven't got the vision necessary all the time, because the enemy forces can move up on you through the valleys and jungles, and you obviously can't see through that. And you've got the grassy hills where you can see, but they're not going to come up the way where you can see. They're going to come in from a bit where you can't see. And when you're outnumbered or your line is thin, it's not easy conditions. So we'll move forward. And these maps, we may refer to these maps later on, but again, this gives us a little idea. Can run us through kind of again the sequence of events around sort of October 23rd, 24th to about the 28th, 29th. We don't have to go into incredible detail, but just to set the scene to bring us into Basilone.
So the Tokyo Express, as it's dubbed, is dumping men by the thousands on a daily basis, starting in late September into mid-October. The Marines know that they're actually watching them come ashore. And there's really nothing they could do about it. And they're watching, they're trying to attack them with their Air Force. So they know that something's brewing, that they know that there's a large attack that is going to happen. What ends up happening is they put the 7th Marines into that position, and it's right towards the base of Bloody Ridge, Edson's Ridge. And you could see there the 164th Infantry. It's around this time that it's a National Guard unit out of North Dakota. They're actually brought in on the lines as well. So this is where the Army really gets their christening in battle in the Pacific Theater in these offensive actions. And they start lining these guys up. Now, what happens next is they're actually covering what you're seeing here. Actually, this is that's the night of the 24th, 25th. Okay, so we're right there. This is what's considered a regimental front. It's 2,500 yards that they're supposed to cover with 3 battalions. What ends up happening is that the Japanese, they actually take a diversionary attack on the Matanikaw. And you see that in the map prior you see this action kind of happening along the Matanikaw, where they send these tanks and men across the Matanikaw. They're completely annihilated by 37 millimeter anti-tank guns. And it's in August, the Japanese use the beach to come down. They come down the coast. In September, they come through the jungle. So right now, it's a crapshoot. You can see the Matanikaw right there where the arrow is. So they're actually coming down around that area. So it's around this time where General Vandergrift, who's the commander of the 1st Marine Division, he's been all in on this whole coastal attack, and everybody else is saying, "Look, no, we don't think that they're going to come through the jungle again. That's what gives them the best element of surprise." So Vandergrift says, "All right, I'm going to take 2 battalions, the 2nd and the 3rd Battalion of the 7th Marines, and I'm going to stick them over there by the Matanikaw." So Chesty Puller, the famous Marine, one of probably the most famous Marines of all time, he's the battalion commander. They say, "Hey, look, we're taking 2 of your battalions, and we're moving them about 4 miles away from you. You're going to have to make do with the 1st Battalion." So right now, what should be a regimental front is now left to about 700 men to cover 2,500 yards, which in jungle terrain, very, very dense jungle. And and again, if you watch the Pacific, they talk about this. It's subtle, where they're like, "Hey, we're singled up on the line," and the Marines, they take into account really 2 ways of defending. If they're defending along a ridge in the grassy areas, they have this defense in depth where they can actually cross machine gun paths. They can do these defense in depth type maneuvers. But in the jungle, really what they rely on is barbed wire lines, and they step back 30 feet from those lines, and that's where they dig in at. And that's really the only way, because you can't do this crossfire maneuvering in the jungle because you can't see. You're maybe.
And that's interesting because I'm referencing the TV show, as I said, I watched last night, is that the TV show, I can imagine, found it difficult to convey what's happening in the action because of, again, it's jungle. So it's very hard, unless you had some kind of overlay map in the bottom corner or something showing people where you're losing track of where people are. And of course, in reality, the danger is that your position holds, but the positions to your left and right haven't held. So do you have to fall back now? Do you wait? It's that unknowing of what's happening to your left and right, which is why runners are so important, because and wireless communications are important as well. But if you lose, if a wire gets cut or knocked out, so communication and actually understanding what's going on in this situation, and then you add the factor that of some of these actions occurring at night, which then amplifies the difficulty of this. So yeah, it's all setting the scene for what's going to come later. But yeah, a battalion holding a regimental line in jungle is not an ideal situation.
No, not in the least. And then actually, it benefits both. I mean, we're going to talk about John Basilone, we're going to talk about Mitchell Page, and in both cases, this confusion actually benefits the Marines, because again, there are times where the Japanese have actually broke through the line and they don't even know it. So there's a few times where, both with Mr. Page and John Basilone, that the Japanese are actually through the line and into the CP areas, and they don't know where they're at just because of the entanglement within the jungle, the confusion that's happening, the miscommunication. So it helps play into the benefit of the defensive positions.
Yeah. So, and let's talk about the setting up of this epic night. And we want to talk about Briggs. And Briggs again is a character in the Pacific, but they don't give much attention to what he's doing and his role there. But it is a part of it there because. And again, when we get to it, there are different types of terrain. There's, as I said, the deep jungle, and there's these grassy knoll kind of areas as well. So explain Briggs's role in this whole defensive setup.
So Ralph Briggs is an A company. He's a sergeant, and they realize that Chesty Puller and the 7th Marines feel that there's going to be an attack headed their way in some form or fashion. They want to get as much notification as possible to be ready for these attacks. So this is actually a unique photo. I actually had this pulled from the National Archives. To my knowledge and a lot of people's knowledge, this is the only publicized photo of Ralph Briggs that's out there. I always wanted to see what this guy looked like because in my mind, again, we talk about senses of bravery and heroism. Although Ralph Briggs wasn't doing something like John Basilone was doing, what he was asked to do, he knew would probably lead to his death. He was essentially asked to go out roughly about a mile in front of the 7th Marine lines and essentially set up a listening post. And what the intention is that if they would start engaging with the Japanese, they would know that they're coming. So he takes roughly about 30 men to this grassy knoll about a mile ahead of the lines with a telephone. And what he doesn't realize is about 2,500 Japanese are really headed towards him. And that's me very miserable and hot on top of Briggs's outpost there. And the Japanese, they know they're there. And so the Japanese are kind of not one step ahead of the Marines, but they know why those Marines are on that hill. And their commanders are telling them, don't engage them, because as soon as they hear gunfire, they're going to bring their artillery down on us. Just let them go. And so these thousands of Japanese, it's like lava going around like a rock, and they're going around this hill towards the 7th Marine lines. And there's that famous scene where he calls Puller on the line saying, you got the whole effing Jap army headed your way. It's at this point where Puller says, get back to the lines. Now, it's easier said than done. It's pitch dark. You have about 3,000 Japanese in front of you and your men, and now you got to make it through the jungle. Some of them do make it back. Briggs himself makes it back, but some of them it takes 2, 3, 4 days for them to make it back to the lines because they're hiding, they're trying to get through, they're getting lost in the jungle. But to me, Briggs, I cannot imagine being assigned something like this to say, hey, here's a phone. You're probably going to die, but you're going to help us. And to me is just, I don't know how I would be able to handle that. And for those guys to do their duty and to do that, knowing exactly why they were out there.
And with all due respect to the enemies in various wars, going out and having a listening post is not a brilliant situation in any combat theater. But in this particular theater, given what the Japanese are capable of when they encounter American patrols it might not just be death. It might also be torture or horrible death. I mean, everybody who's in the military is aware that they might get killed. That goes without saying. And I suppose everybody would hope that if they are going to be killed, it'll be in a nice, quick artillery barrage, and it's just you blink and you're gone. But in this environment, and the Pacific series, I think, does show that with those couple of scenes they see of what happened to people who stumble out the lines or get caught out in the open or something, what the Japanese were capable of. So that adds another level of incredible bravery to what Briggs and his 30 men do, is that going out there and knowing what could be your fate. Death is one thing, but a gruesome, horrific death is something else.
And they know at this point in August, again, they don't really know what the Japanese are capable of. By October, the word's out. Everybody knows what they're capable of, and it is you're not going to be a POW. You will be tortured to death. Yeah. And so I always like to highlight Briggs on this, and again, I was glad that they included him in that series, and just like to always show his photo. Interesting enough, a unique part of the terrain, we talk about the terrain, is that when the Japanese are actually planning this attack, it's roughly around October 10th that they start cutting the trails. They're using maps, the Army, the Japanese Army is using maps that were made by the Japanese Navy. The Japanese Navy is copying maps from the British Navy. And as you can imagine, the Navy really isn't concerned with topographical lines. So they put some squiggly lines in there. They say, we think this is some land. Well, the Army's looking at these kind of verbatim and going, oh, this approach looks pretty decent. It looks pretty flat, and we're going to go with this. And what they don't realize is that the naval officer just kind of squiggled in some lines, and they're going, all we care about are the shorelines and the water. And what it's going to do is actually cause huge catastrophic problems for the Japanese, because as they start going in and out of these valleys and on these ridge lines, they're going, this isn't as flat as the map made it out to be.
And it's not just the flat, it's then the defilades and things that can create difficulties for either side. And you've got to try and work out as a defender where your best position is. And just in pure practical terms, we talked about you visiting there. How easy are these locations to pinpoint? Because you're not that far away from it's not a busy international airport in the sense of JFK, but it is an airport that's used. You're not that far away from it there. So are there trails to follow? Do you have to employ people to show you where these things are? There markers?
Not really. The people of the Solomon Islands they're fantastic people. They're proud people. Some of the older people that live there understand the concept of it. Some of the younger generation really they don't understand. While they're walking out, they can, they see a grenade or a bullet casing. They have no idea why that's even there. A lot of what we know about the battle really comes from an Australian, John Innes, who unfortunately passed away in 2018. Him and a few others really helped kind of establish where these sites are, and he is credited for the Basilone position for finding what is known as the Basilone kind of foxholes. And
it looked to me, I was doing some work with the aerial photo we're going to use. Well, we were using later, and I was looking at Google Earth. It seems to me that the rivers have changed courses and bends and things over the years. They're not exactly where you wouldn't expect necessarily rivers to be exactly where they were 79 years ago in this sort of environment with them wiggling in and out of things. So I was trying to kind of find a way of overlaying the wartime photo on a Google Earth. I just gave up after about an hour of work. But no, it's obviously changed. Dramatic roads and tracks have changed. Where areas that were jungle aren't, and areas that were jungle are. And I thought, no, I'm going to give up on this. It's not worth the effort.
The rivers are a tough one, but the land masses, again, if you look at Bloody Ridge, if you actually look at Briggs Outpost, it almost looks like a fork almost. And then if you go to Google Earth, I mean, it's almost identical. You could see it, and there's certain land masses, and that's really how you can tell. And then what really helps is the wartime ground photos, because if you look at wartime ground photos of Bloody Ridge or some of these other areas, and as soon as there were so many times where if I would have a local guide with me, we would go up to an area and you were just, I knew exactly. I'm like, oh, here it is. Like this is from the photo. So a lot of the jungle terrain and those land masses have remained unchanged over the time.
But with all due respect to you, Brian, that's again you speaking there as someone who's now been there. It's like when I've taken you to Normandy. When you know it instantly, you can show it. But it's that getting to that first bit where you know you're in roughly the right area, and it's that the first time you go to any battlefield, it's just like a kid in a candy store around, not knowing which way's north, not knowing which way's south, and then you get that time where it all starts coming into place. So I can open up Google Earth in Normandy and just pinpoint where I are because I recognize things. But for me, having never been to there, looking at Google Earth, it just seemed impossible. But that's just an interesting side thing for the viewers about how it is that people plan battlefield tours. How do people put this information together? Because especially with an environment of the Pacific, with islands like this, we know that in Normandy there are certain actions, or Italy, for crossroads in towns. Well, the crossroads was there in Roman times, it was there in World War II, and it's still there now. Just maybe a different buildings around it. But in this case, in an environment that's ever changing, because nature is always moving, just even pinpointing where incredibly famous actions took place is not always that easy.
No, and that's
I mean,
why
Burma, Myanmar particularly, is very difficult in certain areas to just pinpoint where these things happen. Chindit operations, for example, which trail they took through Burma, it's difficult. Anyway, we'll move on. So we're getting towards the Basilone action now, and we talked about machine guns, and let's talk about exactly how the Marine Corps are going to be trying to. That we've established they haven't got enough men to defend this perimeter. We've established it's going to be night jungle terrain around them, and the Japanese have a tendency to attack at night. So clearly, an MG is a force multiplier in this type of situation, because you put it in the right place, have lots of ammunition around it, and you can cover a lot of ground with a lot of automatic firepower. So how much effort was put into establishing this defense? I know we're going to talk about barbed wire in a minute, but just run us through what they're trying to do to make the best of their limited numbers in this situation.
So the one thing that the Marine Corps has plenty of is pissed off Marines and ammunition. And that right there is a force multiplier. And again, going back to a few trips, one of the best quotes I ever had was we were climbing up a hill, and we had been there for 4 or 5 days, and we were going up another hill, and one of my friends turns to me and he goes, I can see why they did what they did to the Japanese once they got their hands on them, because you're just so miserable and so angry just climbing up these hills, and the blisters and the sweat, and we didn't even have to worry about people shooting at us. It's just again that terrain. But what the Marines employed on that island, the two biggest factors were the 1917A1 water-cooled machine gun and the 37 millimeter anti-tank gun with canister shot. Which essentially turned this anti-tank gun into a giant shotgun.
Big shotgun, yeah.
And they employed those. John Basilone was actually in charge of a section that had 4 of those. To give you a sense of the ammunition that they had, each gun roughly had about 30,000 rounds of ammunition per gun. So you're talking large amounts of ammunition across 4 guns that you're going to be employing. And again, what they're trying to do as best they can is setting up where you're having those killing fields,
yep.
And those kill boxes that you can set these guns up where they're crossing into each other again. Talk about it, just on the beaches of Normandy, how the guns are not straight pointed out, but they're trying to get that area covered by the guns. You can't really do that in the jungle, so again, you got to do it as best you can, and then employ the barbed wire to help slow them up and stack them up. This photo here is a very unique photo, because we feel that this actually, based on the time that this was taken, that this is actually in and around the Basilone position. So the Marines, what they're doing is they're actually cutting fire lanes down the jungle. And when Paul shows the video, you'll kind of see why they had to cut these fire lanes through the jungle. So what they were doing is they were actually cutting trails into the jungle so that they could see the Japanese, and they were just setting up entanglements of barbed wire. Some of the barbed wire is American barbed wire. Some of the barbed wire is actually they're actually utilizing that barbed wire that's actually on the island. The Lever Brothers plantation was farming coconut trees, so they were kind of pulling barbed wire from the farming areas and utilizing it and crossing it up to help slow the Japanese up. To allow the machine guns to
and that's, you just said a key thing there. You're not going to try and stop the Japanese with barbed wire. You're going to try and slow them up and maybe divert them to the channels that you've prepared where you have your crisscrossing machine gun fire. So you're not going to stop the Japanese, but you are maybe going to influence their movements so that you bring them into your kill zones, which is the standard tried and tested method of a defensive position. And this will come later, of course. The benefit of the water-cooled machine gun is that you've got this sustained fire ability that perhaps with air-cooled, you've got to let it cool down or change barrels.
Right.
Because, again, not treating the Japanese differently in a sense, but we are treating them differently in a sense because they don't necessarily know at this point in the war to stop doing something if they're incurring casualties. A normal army, I'm using the word normal, quote unquote, after going into a murderous machine gun fire would back off and try something else. But the Japanese don't tend to have that ability, or they just kind of keep going back at that same position. So it comes at who's going to win this battle of wills. Is it going to be sustained fire from a defensive position of the Americans, or this sustained pressure by Japanese? And as you say, if you then lose one position, you then lose that combined connecting fire, and then suddenly gaps can appear. So it's a real battle of determination, as well as the deployment of weapons and these rather contrasting tactics of setting up barbed wire machine guns, and the Japanese just kind of, in a sense, running headlong into them. But it was a method that they had some real success with in the previous year or two. So, yeah, amazing stuff. We'll keep on moving. So let's introduce John Basilone. I mean, I'm sure most people watching are fully aware of his career prior to Guadalcanal, and they're aware of what happened to him after this time. But he is about as close as you can get to kind of a combat veteran at this point, isn't it?
Yes, he actually starts in the Army in 1936. He's into the Army until 1939, and in 1940 he joins the Marine Corps because he's sensing something is going to happen, and he wants to be kind of first to fight. He wants to he wants to be the toughest, and the Marine Corps offers that. One of the unique piece of information that a lot of people don't realize is that John Basilone never goes to Parris Island. John Basilone never completes a Marine boot camp. A lot of people don't know that. And as a matter of fact, I've talked to a few Marines that, during their boot camp at Parris Island, they talk about, through these, doors have come some great, Marines and John Basilone. And I'm like, yeah, he never actually went there. Because the Marine Corps said, hey, look, you're trained, you're using the same machine guns that the Army was using. So we're just going to throw you right into the fleet, and you kind of pick it up as you go along. And obviously, he was a phenomenal Marine. It was a quick study, and was immediately put into the fleet.
And it's fair to say that the Marine Corps has a huge tradition of depending on their non-coms, isn't it? I mean, I know a lot of elite forces. I don't like the word elite, but a lot of established, good at their jobs infantry units rely on non-coms, but the Marine Corps particularly has a real sense of that going back in their tradition, as indeed the British Royal Marines, a similar thing. It's that when you've got a shortage of manpower, good non-coms who know what they're doing are, again, like artillery or machine guns, are a kind of force multiplier in that sense, aren't they?
Absolutely, and I'll talk about it towards the end between Mitchell Page and John Basilone. And again, I'm sure some people are probably, already scratching their head going, who the heck's Mitchell Page? And one of the reasons that we feel that Basilone becomes this household name is this aura around, the sergeant, the gunnery sergeant, that it has this mystique around it. And I've actually had this conversation with Richard Frank, who's written arguably the most complete work on Guadalcanal, and he's kind of that same, why is Basilone kind of put up on this pedestal, and Mitchell Page, who essentially does the same thing, if not even crazier than what Basilone does, really is kind of not mentioned, and we think that it's like one of those, well, Page kind of sold out and became an officer, which is an honorable thing to do, but in the Marine Corps, it's when everybody hears gunnery sergeant.
This has been a subject on World War II TV before. You can't single out every hero from an action because then you dilute the public attention. You kind of need to have that one that somehow embodies the essential essence of the story, so the public and the people and the rest of the Marine Corps can get behind that thing. Right. And that's how medals work. Is that anybody who's ever been in the military, any nation, they understand that medals are inherently unfair in the sense that some people have to get them and some people have to not get them to make those that do get them stand out from those who don't get them. If you start giving to everybody, then there's no point having them. But it does mean that in every engagement you look at in history, you look at, well, why is he not getting it? Why is that person getting it and that one not? But then that's the paradox. You simply cannot reward everybody who's brave. You've got to say, okay, in this situation, we're going to go for this guy here. And Basilone, you can see why. Oh,
yeah. I mean,
it fulfills all the needs.
you needed that story, that hero type. He, rugged, good looking guy. He had it all. He had the whole package.
But let's talk about these two as they've come up there. Let's talk about Garland and Powell, because they are integral to the story, but they don't get the attention. So, yeah,
right. So Ed Garland and John Powell. These guys are actually side by side with John Basilone during the entire time. We were actually fortunate enough to actually get John Basilone's testimony for this Medal of Honor action, and he calls out Garland and Powell specifically in there. He actually claims that John Powell is the most bravest man that he ever served with. And Garland and Powell are within Basilone's machine gun section. And really what happens is so the Japanese start attacking around 1 a.m. The action always is the 25th into the 26th. And when the 29th Infantry starts attacking those lines, his guns are essentially 30 yards apart from each other. So he has 2 guns on the left flank, 2 guns on the right flank. Now, this is, I always cautious, and I'm not trying to dilute the John Basilone story in any way, but we've all read it. There's 3,000 Japanese. John Basilone is, somehow he doesn't have his shoes. He's barefoot. He's on the run for 3 nights without food and water, and it's just this huge tall tale. And then when you start breaking it down, and then you actually start reading his testimony, his actual testimony, you're like, wow, there was a lot more to this story. Now, it's not to take away anything what Basilone did, but it's, you start finding the more factual based.
And this is exactly why we do shows like this, and we invite people like you on, Brian, because we've got that story that everybody knows, and we're just going to go a little bit deeper and a little bit wider and say, okay, here's what Basilone did. Isn't he awesome, everybody? And now let's put into context what was happening to his left, what was to his right, bring in a couple other people there, and expand on the story. That's exactly the whole point. But where this sketch we've got here, where did that come from? Because I'm naturally drawn to those kind of hand drawn maps with names on it. It's like they're kind of the holy grail of military maps.
This actually came from a Marine that was actually a 37 millimeter gunner, and what he McGillicuddy was his name, George McGillicuddy, and what he did was they wanted to know who was in each pit, in each position, because again, you see it touched on in the Pacific where Fuller wants everybody on that party line to understand, because what had happened in September is that Japanese were actually getting a hold of field phones, and they're actually talking to the Americans on the field phone saying, yeah, we're still good here. And they're going, who is this? So they're employing these lessons learned during the battle to say, okay, who's in the pit? And so in case we got a call and say, hey, who's there? Is it Williams? Is it Tracy? Is it Dickerson? And if you start getting the R's and the L's mixed up in there, then maybe it's something's amiss. And he had drawn this map out and pointed out where Basilone's guns were. And this is actually one of the first maps that really helped identify the location of his guns. Another unique thing is that Basilone was actually part of a dog company, but on this night, he was actually, his machine gun section was pulled and actually in Charlie Company. So he was actually part of Charlie Company during this, but he was actually as part of dog company. And this happened quite often where Marines were getting temporary promotions to sergeants and then bumped back down. And it was almost kind of like a sports roster where you're getting promoted up to the big leagues and drop back down to AAA and things like that. So this is happening, but this was a very unique map, and this really kind of helped John establish kind of at least a starting point of the Basilone positions.
And so here we are. Here are your photos taken at the site. So I mean, it's for those who will never likely get to this location. This is as close as we're going to get. So explain what we've got. 4 photos, a bit of video. So
yeah, this one right here is actually this is starting up Bloody Ridge. So Basilone's gun pits are roughly probably about 10 to 15 yards behind me. This trail leads up to what would have been Chesty Puller's CP. And that's a pretty steep hill going up, roughly about, I would say, about 120 yards up on the right would be Chesty Puller's CP. And then this here has been dubbed one of the foxholes of Basilone's positions, and really what sent John to really identify these locations is metal detecting and finding huge piles of 30-06 brass in singular piles in this area. John Basilone, to his own word, said that they fired roughly about 126 belts per gun that night. So between the two guns that he has, he's firing close to about 60,000 rounds that night. So there's going to be a lot of brass there. And as you can see, very, very murky. The water, stagnant. It is hot and miserable there. I can't even begin to describe it.
And we can, it's hard on a two-dimensional photo, but we can't see more than 10 foot into that foliage there. And this is daytime, and you're standing there and you're not in danger of being shot at. I mean, one can only imagine how terrifying these positions were, and all the increased sound activity of not just enemy, but insects and birds and creepy crawly stuff, and how sounds echo at night. And you think there's men over to your left and men to your right, but are they still there? Especially when it all starts kicking off. I mean, it's just extraordinary action to imagine being part of.
Absolutely. Yeah, you could see just that why they were trying to cut these firing lanes. They said that it was actually so dense that what they were doing is they were actually chopping off at least about a foot to a foot and a half of the positions in front of them, and the growth was actually so entangled that it was actually still staying suspended in the air. So as they're chopping the bottoms of these off, but what they wanted to do is they actually wanted to see foot traffic, anything that would flash in front of them. Again, here you could see some of the water, just the standing water there. And again, what does the water bring? Mosquitoes. And these guys aren't moving. Their holes are filled. Right prior to the attack, it's raining. And so their foxholes are filled with water. And this here is a video, walking through this area.
Yeah,
I think I actually got walking up to right here. I found it. It was a huge, there, right there. Whatever that spider, that was a nasty looking.
Oh yeah. He doesn't look friendly.
No. You imagine just trying to run through the night and just getting that right in the face, and it's in your helmet. And again, this is kind of the areas that they would have been. So right about here, I want to say, right where that pile of water is there, that's where there was. There's still a pigtail there. The pigtails were actually these corkscrew things that they dug into the ground, and it had these 3 loops on it, and these stemmed all the way back from the First World War, and that's where one of the lines. So the pigtails from the lines are actually still there. They're still in the ground, so it kind of gives you a sense of where the lines were, but you could just see how thick this jungle is, and again, just the heat and humidity. Basilone, during the battle, to his own testament, is he's actually on the ground, on the deck, as again, if we're using our Marine terminology, and he's now brought over a gun that from one of his flanks. One of the guns are both of the guns are down on the right flank. He brings one over. He carries one over with him, and one of the guns has actually been taken out. It's been damaged by shrapnel. And the other gun actually has a ruptured case that he's able to fix. He's able to get 2 guns up and running, and he begins manning those guns by himself. So he's manning those guns by himself, rolling between gun to gun. He also has on him a 1911 pistol. And what's happening is this is at the point where the Japanese are actually busting through the lines. they don't even see him on the ground. They're actually running by him. And what he's doing is he's picking up his 1911 and just turning around, shooting them in the back, and then going back and firing the machine gun more into the line. Now, the story is that everybody hears is that 3,000 Japanese are barreling down on John Basilone. In actuality, the unit that's attacking John Basilone is the 29th Regiment. More in particular is the 9th Company of the 29th Regiment. So he has roughly about 130 men that are really barreling down on his gun positions. Now, whether it's 3,000 or 130, in his fighting hole is really him and 3 other guys. That's really all he has in that position, and they're taking on an onslaught of around 130 Japanese. So again, not taking anything away from him, 130 guys that are screaming bonsai and coming at you, and is got to be terrifying. The one thing that Basilone says himself, the one thing that terrified him the most was the dynamite. What they were actually doing was they were bringing in their version of Bangalore torpedoes to try to bust through the barbed wire. But what they ended up doing was they were actually lighting the fuses and trying to throw it at the Marine positions. So Basilone says that he could see the dynamite tumbling, and just the concussion and the explosions from the dynamite was just shattering his head and his helmet. And that was the thing that really scared him the most was the dynamite.
Mm. I just included that art print there, and there's quite a lot online, folks, you can look at, and they all give a completely different indication of what the terrain would be like. And I'm assuming most of the artists had not actually been to the location, so they just use a bit of artistic license and blend things up. And it is that problem that these producers have of trying to convey an action through the medium of art, because if you had do you have foreground, you have background, it would just be impenetrable jungle. So but it does give us an idea of what was going on there. And but unless there's anything else to say about the Basilone action, because it's incredible, and we will show his Medal of Honor ceremony photos later on. But you've been chomping at the bit to bring in Mitchell Page to the story, who also is decorated with the Medal of Honor and less known. So it's a similar story, but it's not exactly the same. So run us through what he's doing.
So just to touch on it at the end, Basilone ends up counting the actual count in front of his guns is roughly about 38 that he's credited for in killing the Japanese. So that's really the pile in his gun. And then also too, just another quick, I guess trivial, question or anything that would come up in the series of the Pacific. It shows him actually going out and pushing over the Japanese because the bodies are stacked.
Yeah, they're in his field of fire. Yeah.
To his own admission, it's not actually him. It's actually John Garland that does that. Garland's the guy, and Basilone actually orders him out to do it. So Basilone says, "Garland, get out there and give me a clear field of fire." And Garland puts down his rifle, runs out, and starts pushing over the Japanese to give Basilone a clear field of fire. So shout out to Garland. He's a Pittsburgh native, so he's from Pittsburgh. So got to give Garland a shout out there. But speaking of transitioning then into Pittsburgh, is Pittsburgh's own Mitchell Page. And again, we're very proud of Page here. We actually just dedicated a memorial to him in his hometown of Charleroi, which is on the outskirts of the city. Mitchell Page is also in the 7th Marines. Now, his position is about 4 miles towards the Matanikau. He's in H Company, and that red dot there is his position. And the night that the 24th to the 25th, the Japanese are still probing his area. So Page is a very, very smart machine gunner. He tells his guys, "We are not shooting our machine guns if necessary." He goes, "I want nothing but grenades being used." And what they do is they actually stack up a pile of grenades because if you start shooting a machine gun, it's immediately evident where the lines are. You can follow the tracers, and you can immediately pinpoint where those are. When people are just throwing grenades down a hill, it's hard to find out where those grenades are actually coming from. Page is actually on a very, very, it's called Cola Ridge, and it is steep. I don't know if you had any of the photos. Yeah, so this is the area of where Page's guns are, and I think there's one that's pointed. I thought I had one that was more pointed down.
Probably
that one.
There we go.
Yeah. So this gives you a sense of the steepness of this ridge that Page is on. So the 24th and the 25th happen. Most of the action is happening along Basilone's sector. But then on the 25th and the 26th, that's when the Japanese are now attacking on this position. This now stems from the confusion, the utter confusion, because the whole premise of this attack plan is that they're hitting it simultaneously. They want to hit the line so that they're not able to move artillery. This kind of mimics the Battle of Bastogne, where a lot of people don't realize that the Germans aren't really hitting the 101st on an all-out assault on every sector of that line. They're almost hitting them in pockets, which is allowing the 101st to move the artillery around to help in that battle. It's kind of, this is happening here, but this is happening out of just sheer confusion of the Japanese. They're not able to communicate well, and it really allows the Marines to kind of move guys and patch them in on the line. On the 25th, on the 26th, the Japanese start attacking in a full force against Mitchell Page, and immediately they began to get overrun. He's commanding the same section, a similar section as John Basilone's commanding, but his men are getting killed in droves. He's watching them getting bayoneted. At one point, he actually, Fox Company, who's on his flank, he sees Fox Company just completely pull off the ridge. Page understands what's at stake here. There really is a point where Page is all alone. He is all alone by himself on this ridge, and every humanistic tendency is telling him to get out of there. I mean, in reality, I know I would. I think I would be finding somewhere to hide. You have no idea of the amount of Japanese forces that are coming up over that ridge towards you. This isn't a kind of sort of, he is alone. He knows what's at stake. At one point, he's running in between his guns. So he's actually running from one machine gun, firing it, running over to the next one, firing that gun. He's actually so pissed off at Fox Company, he to his own account, he actually picks up a rifle and starts firing at his own Marines. He's shooting at his own Marines, trying to get their attention, screaming, hold the line, hold the line, hold the line. Because he realizes that this is it. I mean, if they let them come over that hill, there is nothing but a straight shot to that airfield. And then the back end of the 164th Infantry Regiment, and the rest of the 7th Marines, the 5th Marines, and the 1st Marines. So Page knows what's at stake. At one point, he actually sees a Japanese officer kind of eyeball the machine gun, and they're each about 30 yards, 40 yards away from this gun. And Page they're both in a dead sprint towards this gun. Whoever's going to get there first is really going to be the winner. Page gets there, is able to gun down the Japanese officer. This is very reminiscent to kind of a little round top action. The 20th Maine, Joshua Chamberlain, and really what Basilone does next is really unheard of at that time. And what he does is he's able to gather up a few guys from the CP. He's gathers up about 5 or 6 guys. He picks up the water-cooled machine gun, and which is arguably hot. He's burning his arm. He slings it up, throws the belt of ammunition, tells the men, follow me, we're leading a charge down this hill, and proceeds to lead a bayonet charge with a water-cooled machine gun, weighing roughly probably about 80 pounds, down the hill, firing it into the Japanese lines. The Japanese are getting ready to get their final thrust to take Page's positions. And Page, again, they don't know what the heck's coming down at them. All they see is this nut job coming down at them with a water-cooled machine gun spraying into him. They don't know if it's a full regimental force. Is it a battalion? And it's at this point that the Japanese are they give up. Page holds that position in that sector of his line, and for that he's awarded the Medal of Honor for his action.
Well, and this is echoing back to what we said at the beginning about this being very much infantry against infantry in close quarters. This isn't the battles we think of later. And that is maybe a good time to ask you the question the Great Dominion asked earlier, which is the role of mortars and artillery in a battle. But the areas in front of the gun pits and barbed wire were pre-registered. But how much is there in the way of mortar support for this? And the difficulty, of course, is when you lose positions is the accuracy of fire. But run us through what was available in support for these two positions, either Basilones or Pages or the line generally.
So there is actually a phenomenal support of mortars and artillery. The 11th Marines are the artillery on shore. They are. Obviously being a huge fan of the Marine Raiders. The Marine Raiders are always credited with the Battle of Bloody Ridge and Edson Ridge, but in reality, even the Raiders themselves even kind of tip their caps and say it's the 11th Marines and the artillery that really win the day for them, and it's happening here as well. The artillery are pre-registered in front of Basilone's line. The mortars, they are really, again, they're not given enough credit. Obviously, me having a huge soft spot for mortars, they are really what's helping win the day for these battles as well. The Japanese actually think that they actually are thinking that we have automatic artillery. When some of the handful of prisoners that are captured, when they come back, they're asking about this automatic artillery, and we're like, we don't have automatic artillery. We just have a lot of it. And Leckie actually talks about it in his book, actually during the bombardment in the September engagements, where he said his teeth were just aching from the amount of artillery that they were throwing down at the Japanese. The Japanese they were not very smart in how they rallied their guys. They continued to do this time and time again, where they would shoot up a flare, and the flare meant that there was a rally point, and we figured that out quite quickly. And so we always said, hey, wherever you see that flare go up, everybody just dump on there. That's why when they would come across piles of dead Japanese, typically it was a rallying point that the artillery or the mortarmen.
And surely, Brian, it's not just the number of tubes; it's also observation, the ability to rein in a target acquisition, communications is important. We just did the show last night, the Red God of War, about Sasho took us through how the Russians are using artillery and how the Germans are using it. And although the Russians had way more power to bear, their communications weren't as good as the Germans. They didn't have the telephones between them. They didn't have the well-trained men to do the sighting, to do that target acquisition. And of course, that's something the Marine Corps would have had very experienced people in charge of these mortars, because it's all very well having lots and lots of mortars. It's being able to direct fire where you need it,
right,
when you want it, accurately, and being able to communicate and keep people updated. And the Japanese, in that sense, aren't quite as advanced as the Americans are in terms of communication.
No, they're not, and that's what plagues them. They try to space out their attacks. They get out of communication range. Runners can't reach them, and again, this is going to be really their downfall. They really are a formidable force. Again, a lot of people think that the Japanese, luck's on our side in a few cases, where if they were able to have their communication set, it may be a different story in some of the battles. But again, there's a little bit of luck involved, and just the Japanese attitude and the cockiness that they have about themselves. There's no way that these Americans can beat us. There's no way. And like you said, they keep repeating the same tactics over and over again. John Basilone says this in his testimony, where he says that they're a very good fighting force. They're very rugged. They know how to fight in the jungles, but he basically questions their tactics, where he's like, they just keep doing the same thing over and over, running into our machine guns. And he's like, we were obliging them in dispersing ammunition, but it just always confused the Marines. That it's like, why do you keep doing this?
We get the same thing with the Germans sometimes in the ETO with certain divisions or regiments would always do their flanking maneuver to the right. They never did on the left. They would always do it. And there was that sort of Pavlovian thing about if you press
maybe
them,
it'll work this time.
They're going to counterattack, and it's going to be from the same direction. It's that, and maybe this comes down to the difference between an army where initiative is allowed to flourish, and you've got people allowed to show their skills in the Americans and British and the Germans and Japanese, right, which is much more authoritarian. You do what you're told to do, and and maybe that's a fundamental difference. I mean, I'm not a great fan of Stephen Ambrose. That's one of the things Stephen Ambrose said, is that we were fighting with armies that we allowed skills to be encouraged and develop, whereas some of the foes we were fighting did not. There was a system in place, and the system trumped everything else, and that was it. But anyway, let's move on to the medals and the fact that Page and Basilone got the medal. And I know the first thing, whenever you send me that, I've seen that photo before, the one on the left. You sent it to me, is that they're clearly been given those jackets for that ceremony, haven't they?
Yeah,
that's not his. That's someone's lent that to him. Surely that's not.
This is so. Yeah, it's funny because when on the Pacific, they show the ceremony that's taking place. And I remember vividly having conversations with people going, this wouldn't have happened. The Marine Corps, they're very, their uniforms, they were impeccable. But after they get pulled out of Guadalcanal, they really have nothing. They're waiting for the ships to come in with their uniforms. Everything is pretty much rotted away. So what they actually have here are Australian field dress jackets.
Yeah, and, it's been someone's given them something to be a bit smarter.
Just throw this on.
And it's not worked. It's not worked. As a battle dress guy, I'm looking at that going, he looks like a sack of shit. I mean, I'm not saying that Basilone was a bad because he's the Medal of Honor, but the first thing I notice is just how he's all coming apart in the middle there, and
the jackets are all frumpy and they're like coming out of them and they're just baggy, and it was funny because like when I first saw that in the episode where they show the Medal of Honor, and I'm like, man, they could have did a better job with those uniforms. But then you start like reading into it, and you see these photos, the actual photos. You're going, no, they pretty much nailed it. They look like they were like in trash bags, where it's just all like gig on.
Talking about the Pacific, we just got a question there from the Great Dominion about were the characters of Manny Rodriguez and JP Morgan real people?
Yeah, it's funny. There was actually a show. It was a podcast or whatever, where they actually had Bruce McKenna, who was a writer from the Pacific. They had him on there, but it was pre-recorded. And this was one of the questions where there's no record really of them. We believe that they were made up. I'm trying to figure out why they were, because again, you have two real characters that are running with Basilone, in Garland and Powell. You have two actual guys. They went to the lengths of including Briggs. Why not include these guys? I don't know. But it's just one of those storylines that they have. This is a unique photo. Again, this is a photo you don't see at a different angle of the Medal of Honor citation. You can see the Medal of Honor in the back, the officer holding the medal, getting ready to be presented. General Vandergrift is standing there. Again, you could see that at this point now they've had their divisional patch on the shoulder of Vandergrift standing there, the blue diamond, the red one, and the words Guadalcanal written down it. And again, Basilone and Page. And then the other gentleman in there is Merritt Edson, commander of the Marine Raiders at the time, getting his Medal of Honor as well. I don't know why they made up those characters. Again, it's just it was weird because again, you go from like Band of Brothers, which really, they went to great lengths of using actual people and names, and here they kind of took some. And I understand it's a little bit different because you're now crossing different books, different material.
It's something to do with plot development. It's probably that's the only reason. It's to do with how they want to tell the story, not because they're slighting somebody else. It's to do. I mean, I've not gone into the depths of understand the Pacific and as I have with Band of Brothers, but I'm sure Bruce would give us a reason if we asked him.
Yeah, I was bummed that it was pre-recorded because I wanted to ask the question. So hopefully get that answer. But
and then we'll finish off the conversation after this. But this is a little bit of from Victory at Sea, which we used a bit last time, which actually shows this the ceremony. So we'll play this. This has got audio, folks. So
and this here, I just want to because I think we were having internet connection issues. This is actually taking place as an award ceremony. Admiral Nimitz is handing out some awards here, and really listen to the words of this, because I think I anytime I give a talk about the battle or I talk about it, I always really end with this quote, because I think it summarizes the importance of this battle and what it meant to the Allied victory in the Pacific and the battle for Guadalcanal. So really, the words speak volumes.
Great intro. We'll play it now then.
Commander-in-Chief, Pacific Ocean areas, flies down from Pearl Harbor to pay what small tribute is within man's province. If there was horror and ferocity, there was also courage and self-sacrifice. If there was death, filth, and disease, the Marines turned the tide of war and stopped their enemy. The Japanese will advance no further. And as the surviving Marines wave goodbye, one of the greatest tales of heroism slips out of focus into history. To these men go the honors accorded to Greeks at Thermopylae, the colonials at Valley Forge, the British at Waterloo, and now, the Americans at Guadalcanal.
Great stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, and again, at that time, really everybody is hanging on every word of that. What's happening in that battle, and again, it's just there's just constant ups and downs. Basilone and Page are a very small part, a very important part of this, and again, Basilone ends up going back to America on a war bond drive. Page actually stays in the Pacific, and he actually gets promoted to an officer, serves after the Cape Gloucester campaign, comes back to train Marines. He passes away in 2003, actually has a G.I. Joe doll, modeled after him. And Page, obviously, after his war bond drive, returns to service and is killed.
Basilone.
Ujima.
Basilone. You said Page again.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Basilone returned to his men and was killed on Iwo Jima on the first day.
Well, we've got a question here for you, and it's, what does Brian think of "I'm staying with my boys"? I don't know what that means, so you have to explain what that means.
Yeah, so "I'm Staying with My Boys" is a book that was written. It's bad. It's a bad book. It's written kind of in a first person context from Basilone's, and just it's like, I don't know. He says in the book, I think Garland and Powell are killed. They're not. They survived the war. It's kind of all of the tall tales that are said about Basilone. He incorporates them into the book. I got about.
We'll move on from that, but to bring things to an end, because we talked about the fact you have been to Guadalcanal, you have walked these areas. Are there any kind of myths about this battle that still endure about either Basilone or Page or the defense in general or Puller or something that you kind of every time you see it you go, oh no, that's not true? Is there anything like that?
I think I touched on it with the Basilone stuff. Again, just these tall tales. Obviously, I try to correct a little bit of that. I touch on the Vuza. The Vuza thing pops up on social media a lot. I talk about that. If you want to go, people want to listen to that, that's on the one episode we talk about Alligator Creek. But the one thing I guess that's really that's talked about with the battle a lot is just their equipment, in terms of when the Navy leaves, that they're in terms of their food and water supply and medicine and things like that. But the one thing that they have plenty of, and it's
ammo.
The Marine Corps is ammo, and again, you're never really going to demoralize a Marine as long as they have ammunition and an enemy to fight.
And I think the Pacific fails a little bit. It's implying that each gun's got like 3 or 4 belts for it. I don't think they get across the amount of ammunition available. It looks a little bit desperate that they're kind of pulling out individual belts and things, and it's all, they've got nothing left.
I mean, Basilone himself, again, just for his 4 guns on one night, you're talking 120,000 rounds of ammunition just for 4 guns. So, it's
insane. Yeah, I mean, it's incredible.
Right. And not only that, you have the artillery, you have a lot of that. But the one thing, and I think I talked about this briefly on the other show, is and they do not get their due, is the air crews and the air mechanics that keep the Cactus Air Force. The reason they call it the Cactus Air Force is because the cactus is the code word for Guadalcanal, for America.
Well, it's funny you should say that, Brian, because in Aviation Pacific Week that's coming up in November, we have a show coming up about the defense of Henderson Field and the use of communications. And so that will be coming up in a future show. So well anticipated there.
Perfect. Yeah, because those mechanics, again, time and time again, they're every night they got from, a certain amount of hours that they go, okay, we got to swap this engine into that plane. We got to take this gun from that plane, put it in there to keep those planes going up at 6, 7 a.m. every morning to go up and start patrolling. And they're really some of the unsung heroes.
Yeah, again, it's been a recurring theme. We always talk about the commandos, the paratroopers, the Marines, and it's all the support troops and the vital part of the link. And just want to reference, because I'm going to put you in touch with, there's a viewer watching us, Kurt is watching us, whose uncle was PFC Stanley C. Rowlett, who was in A Company, 7th Battalion Marines, was killed on October 25th somewhere near Henderson Field. So he would like more information about how his uncle was killed. So I'm going to put you in touch with him via Facebook.
Yeah, and actually I can get his, unfortunately with COVID, the National Archives are still shut down. I have a list, but the Marine Corps was phenomenal at keeping records. That's how we were able to get the photo of Briggs. They kept crazy detailed records about the Marines. So I'm able to pull his records. So, give him my information. We could definitely have his records pulled, his photos, all of his service photos, everything. Be glad to help him.
Well, Kurt will get in touch with me via Twitter, and I'll get in touch with you via Brian. We'll get emails exchanged so you can put him in touch. And again, it adds another little part to the story, and it's one of those things that I love about World War II TV, is those little extra little bits that come out of something where someone finds a show. I've had a number of people who found my shows who had a relative killed in a battle I talk about, or their relative was mentioned in a show we talked about. And that's the amazing thing about YouTube, is essentially a big search engine. And so people find shows I've done, and it's really, really gratifying to put those little connections together, because none of us knows everything. And it's adding another little human dimension to this story of another person killed there, and what happened to him and how he fitted into this story it's rewarding for Kurt on a personal level. It's rewarding for you on a research level, and it's rewarding for me on a doing the show level. So everybody kind of gains out of this. So I'll put you in touch. So but as
he would have served in the same company as Briggs. Actually, Briggs was A Company. So I'd be curious to see, maybe is maybe he was part of the outpost. It could have been a possibility, because there were some KIA during that, but we can definitely find that out.
We can, and folks, if anything happens, develops from that, we'll do a follow up. We'll perhaps invite Brian back on, invite Kurt back on, and we'll do a follow up show. But right now, it remains me to say to thank what we've got coming up next. I'll come back and say goodbye in a second. So, folks, another show tomorrow. So, usual time of 7 p.m. UK time or 2 p.m. Eastern time. We have Lance Zedrick coming on, talking about some of the missions the Alamo Scouts did beyond the one we know about, the famous Great Raid that we covered in the last show. And one of the particular missions we're talking about tomorrow is this one where they rescued 100 missionaries that were out there and from the prisons of the Japanese for 2 years. Great stuff. Then Lance has prepared just another amazing PowerPoint presentation packed full of photos. So if you want to know more about these amazing raids into jungles, that's tomorrow, the Alamo Scouts. Robert Lyman is on a Monday. We've got 2 shows on Monday. We've got a live show from Malaysia, 9 o'clock in the morning UK time, where we got cameras in Malaysia. They're discussing the defense of Malaya in 1942. Then in the evening, Robert Lyman, the British historian, is coming on talking about Among the Headhunters, the amazing story of a C-46 commander that was shot down to Burma and what happened to the occupants of that aircraft and how they encountered a tribe of Nagua who were known for being headhunters. So, and then we've got Daniel Burke later in the week. We've got Philip Bradley, Shaggy Ridge, incredible story of Australian bravery. So Jungles Week is really diverse. I love the fact we're covering different areas, different stories, different nations. It's really fantastic. But right now, it remains me to say thank you very much to my old friend Brian Domitrovich. It's been good fun, and I will let you go off and have your Saturday lunch with Carolyn and the kids. And as usual, you can check us out on Twitter. Please consider becoming a patron so we can help support what we're doing here on World War II TV. And your knowledge is fantastic. And I can't wait for us to put our heads together to come up with another show because I love talking to you. It's great.
Hey, this is fantastic, Paul. Again, this is a fantastic channel, and really, I think out of all of the mess that has been these past couple of years, I think this is one of the highlights to really come out of this. A lot of this online content.
It's a low benchmark. A crappy 2 years.
I tell you what, I've learned so much from your guests, and it's just great to get these stories because they would never get out there. Being able to hear stuff from Burma and all these different theaters that you just never, would encounter in a mainstream.
Well, that's exactly what we're trying to do. I mean, because mainstream telly is just the same. Battle of Britain, Dam Busters, 101st into Normandy, all of which we find interesting. But there is a big, wider world out there with some incredible stories, and there are historians and experts out there with so much to share who wouldn't get a platform on these conventional TV, and if they did, it would be for a 2-minute soundbite, and we wouldn't be talking for something as we've done for an hour and a half over one action, which is fantastic. So, well, great. It's been great talking to you, Brian. So this is Paul Woodadge for World War II TV saying enjoy the rest of your Saturday. I will see you all again tomorrow for Alamo Scouts and lots more rescues and missions into the jungle. So this is Paul Woodadge for World War II TV Jungles Week saying thank you very much for your time.